think I'm probably not making a mistake by saying that we have all learnt a tremendous amount of detail about the biography of Haber, which I certainly didn't know, and that we should maybe take that as the start of our discussion here in the panel. I'd like to turn first to Professor Thomas Potthast, and I will just because of time, I will just make a very short introduction of the persons in the panel. Professor Thomas Potthast is full professor for ethics, philosophy and history of the life sciences and co-director of the International Center for Ethics in the Sciences and Humanities at the University of Tübingen here in Germany. Maybe I can just start with you and ask you, I think if we start maybe at the end, I think it became very clear because of the positive appreciation from many of his fellow scientists that in fact we have very much two very different sides of Fritz Haber, and I think when we have been looking at his appreciation, we have often gone from the positive to the negative, and now we're back really having to look at both sides. May I ask you if you would like to comment on the sides which we've seen, the positive and of people where sometimes we're quite surprised. For example, the renaming of the Institute through Bonhoeffer, I think for me was a big surprise. Would you like to comment?
Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the lecture. I would, as an ethicist, I would like really to turn away from asking the question whether a certain scientist has been a good man or woman or not. I think the structural lessons we could learn are much more interesting. So one perspective is that, of course, a person like Haber, who was in a way a criminal, if you stick to the Hager Landkriegsordnung, which is kind of a legal fact. And on the other hand, the person himself is very interesting, fascinating, very faceted in many things. For me, the most interesting point to see is that you could be a world-class scientist doing world-class science and still be in several respects immersed in a practice which is deeply morally wrong. So there is no such thing as the contradiction between being a good scientist and doing morally evil things, which we tend to think about after following the Second World War and looking to the practices of the National Socialist state, that, you know, every scientist who was doing wrong was kind of a bad scientist. And what we could learn from the Haber case as an extreme case in any respect is that this idea is not the case if we look to history, which should remind us that doing good science itself does not prevent us from being on the wrong side of issues like human dignity, for example, with regard to chemical warfare.
If we look at the question as a structural question, what does that mean when we think of appreciation and also the critical appreciation of scientific development when it is coming from the disciplines? I would also ask Doris Wedlich this question, because obviously if we look at the scientific the endeavors of Haber, then it is progress in a very kind of a scientific way when you don't look at the application of what has been used. So how do we have to start ethical questions, and how can we start ethical questions in this kind of a situation where biography, if I understood you properly, Professor Friedrich, biography, also, of course, science itself, also the ambitions of science, and context. So how do we look at the responsibility of starting a discussion on what we can learn from an extreme case, Haber?
I would have two reactions, but I do not want to speak now. I spoke long enough. I would like to actually.
Can I ask if you are also, if you think that is the right kind of answer when we sort of think about structure? I mean, we can't obviously have black and white, but at the same time, we do tend to celebrate our heroes, and Nobel Prize winners are heroes. So does the fact that they are very extreme, so extremely successful scientists also lead to the possibility that we only see them as heroes? Is that maybe something which we do have to address?
Well, the category of a hero is not what is in my language game as a moral philosopher, in some sense. So I'm a little bit reluctant to comment on that. Okay. However, what is interesting is that we shouldn't go into something like a balancing game, saying, well, he has, you know, his high merits in scientific and industrial applications, so that kind of balances his criminal activities in chemical warfare. That should be maybe one step to say, well, if a person has done morally wrong, and I think there are good reasons to stress that with regard to the development, so the strong advocacy to develop chemical warfare as well as being kind of an organizing person within that, in some sense is more or less uniquely clear that this is a moral failure, which does not make the whole person a moral villain or something like that. And this is what we have to acknowledge. We could see that specific action of a historical person like Haber from our today's perspectives, but also from the perspectives of warfare in 1915 have been wrong, legally and morally, which should stand for itself and should not be balanced against with other kind of laudable inventions or something like that. And this is, if you want to have an ethical debate on that, I think that could be the case. Second point is, in order maybe to stimulate a little bit of discussion, I would go so far to say what we could learn from Haber today is that science should not be so close to power and make so close friends with military powers and maybe also with political powers like Haber did.
That is, of course, one of the major dilemmas with power and science and freedom of science. But now for
I would say that it's one of the problems in America that actually scientists are not being listened to by the current government at all, climate change, etc. So I'm not completely sure whether this argument is sufficiently general. But I just wanted to ask you, actually, what would you think about the following? Is there any extenuating circumstance in the fact that chemical weapons in World War I were first used by the French, not by the Germans? And the reason why, actually, it's not widely known, Haber knew about it, and Supreme Command knew about it. The reason why the public doesn't know about it is, in the first place, because history is written by the victors, etc. The German chemical attack was a part of a kind of triplet of highly compromising acts by Germany: chemical warfare, the invasion of Belgium, the sinking of Lusitania. So I think that one could argue or state as a matter of fact that what Haber did was that he used actually a chemical agent competently, whereas the French used it in August 1914 incompetently. And the reason was that actually chemical warfare in France was, until Ypres, was essentially in the hands of the military. And they just did not have competent enough people. However, after Ypres, the French let on their chemists on chemical warfare, and Victor Grignard, for instance, got highly engaged on their part, and then they continued doing an effective chemical warfare in World War I against Germany. So would you consider this as an extenuating circumstance, that Haber just did competently what the French did incompetently?
First of all, regarding with that, my answer would be two wrongs don't make a right. The second point is doing things competently is a description which does not relate to the question whether this action or the result of this action is ethically right or wrong. So it's a disjunct description, and of course, I mean the word irony is way too weak with regard, of course, to the history which was not mentioned today, but which is well known, that also the development of insecticides relating also later to the production of Zyklon A and then later Zyklon B was something like a competent development of the way to kill living beings. I'm not saying this in order to be polemic, but to make clear that the description of an efficient or an effective measurement to do something is logically disjunct from the question whether this is in the context of ethically or politically acceptable practices. And I would be very strong on making this distinction.
Very short answers that I then draw Doris Wedlich into the
very
conversation.
Very briefly, because this is a factual point. Zyklon A and B were not developed to kill humans. They were developed as fumigants and misused.
Well, but
everything can be misused, even a knife.
Yeah.
You can use it to cut your bread.
Okay, now I need a minute to dismiss the kitchen knife ethics, and here's my very brief reason to do that. If you have a view on science and technology which is purely instrumental, and this instrument could be used for good or for bad purposes, this is the kitchen knife example, I would go that if you look what kind of device you are developing, and working in a context which is rather close to environmentally or health-related dangerous practices is not as neutral as other devices. So, and now we would have a very complicated debate in the philosophy of technology and science, whether you could identify practices, technologies, which are much more prone to possible misuse or bad use than others. And then this model of kitchen knife breaks together, because technology in that sense is not per se neutral or instrumental. I would need a little more time to make that clear, but the example you show is that historically the people who have been developing insecticides on Zyklon later also contributed to the development of what was the later use of that. So there is also kind of a personal continuity, which makes clear that once people are on a track with regard to military or other dubious uses of their sciences, have moved themselves into a context where it is much more difficult to get out of again.
But it's being made until this day and used as an insecticide.
Okay, I would like to draw Doris Wedlich into the...
I would like to turn a little bit the discussion and coming back to the issue, could it happen today again? and what is our responsibility as scientists. And when I read the biography of Fritz Haber, I asked me what would happen when I'm in such a situation. And I mean that I learned that a lot of circumstances, that means the exclusion, for example, that Fritz Haber, I guess, felt as a Jew in an upcoming anti-Semitic environment. What does it did to him and in his decision? And it was for me when I read the biography that it was a kind of over-assimilation, how he reacted to this environment. That he said, I should change to a different religion and I should be the best German I could be. And for example, that the national movement we observe today and also the ignorance of the climate change by a president of the US, then I ask indeed what is coming up and in what kind of surrounding we are, and should be aware of it, how the political development also in the eastern part of Europe, how does it bring or change our behavior, and what have we to do today to reflect, critically reflect what we are doing and how independent research should be. And this is, I think, important for me, that we can learn from Fritz Haber's biography, I guess. And we have to discuss it with our students, with us as scientists, I guess.
Okay, let me just add on to that point. Some of the points you've been making are, of course, make it very necessary to think about how we have interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary perspectives and aspects. For some of the things, assimilation, that's my kind of area, the area of integration of different cultures. But if we look at the scientific point, then I think we also have to ask, we have to be careful that we don't excuse the scientific experts from reflecting within their own methodological and scientific competence on the way that our development in their sciences may be used in a certain societal or personal context. So I think one of the things we should be discussing is, do we do this? Do we really have a kind of a early warning system within our specified sciences to say, well, you know, we have a lot of things in the cupboard, developments which could be used in a very wrong way if they get into the wrong hands. See your example of Trump. So how do we organize this discussion within academia? Do we teach our students enough to look at this point? And maybe a point I'd like to ask all. We do often have the argument that any time and energy used to talk about these issues which are not in a narrow sense belonging to the actual science which is being taught or which is being developed is a waste of time. It's a waste of academic time. How do we combat that kind of thinking?
So my opinion is, and I think we do a bit, but not enough. Mm-hmm. And I would like to have such topics better integrated also in the PhD schools or in the education, classical education, I think in chemistry, in biology. And when we think about also the last development, CRISPR-Cas development and the application to the human beings, I think we learned that here the community couldn't stop the development, and I was really disappointed about it. And so I think we have to do it, and we have to confront the students with all these developments, so that, and I think the solution is the open discussion and to look at the different aspects, and also to see, as I mentioned before, the circumstances, the environment, the cultural, you mentioned, differences, and the religious differences is also very important. And this, I think, is really important to teach, to discuss, and to do it at all levels we have here at KIT.
We now have a short discussion, sorry, a short answer, and then we go to the public.
We have two kind of competing and conflicting ideas. One idea is, as scientists, and I mean all sciences and humanities, we should be impartial, we should be as neutral as possible. But on the other hand, we all live as citizens and have to stand up, hopefully, for a liberal democracy. So this would be like Habermas called it, I put my hat as a scientist on and I talk this and that, and then I change my hat. However, the different pathway would be to say that if we take the idea of academia seriously, we need spaces where we listen to each other, where we are willing to change our minds due to better arguments from others, and that's rather close to ideas how politics in liberal democracies are being taken. And so there is a structural link, which Karl Popper already stressed, between the ideas how we do science and academia and how we do democracy, and that's the other point to do. And if I may, that's my last sentence. I have the privilege to teach all the biology students on the bachelor level in Tübingen. All have to go to my lecture, all have to go to seminars. 1/3 finds it boring. 1/3 finds it okay, and 1/3 says, well, this is really what we needed. And so I think this distribution is as in any subdiscipline. Second point, and this is much more important, I think the question you were raising have to be placed really in the education on the PhD student level. Because there people are close to the science, they are close to questioning what are they doing. So I think this is a very major entry point, and we should give PhD students the space and the resources to do that.
I would of course say general studies for all at all levels, but now I go to the public. If I may,